Well, hello summer, it's lesson 3. We're going to be making a companion block in lesson number 3 that we're going to put together with the blocks from lesson number 2. And as we do this, we're going to start off with our specialty ruler cutting. Much of what we're cutting in this block is the same as what we cut in the other block, but we're going to look at the specialty rulers again because I want to make sure that we understand that half rectangle. So we're going to look at the half rectangle. Now we're still working out of a 3.5 inch strip, but I'm going to show you first how to cut those half rectangles with other sizes. So I'm starting with my scraps from my first block that I had used, and I've got a wide variety of scraps, and if I'm making this scrappy, I would be cutting some out of every piece because for each of the 4 units we're making, we need 8 of these half rectangles. So I've got my background here, and what I'm doing right now is this is not the size you're going to be cutting, but I want to show you how cool it is to work with specialty rulers, because even if I take this down to a smaller size, I can still use the same specialty rulers. So what I'm doing right now is I'm cutting a 2.5 inch strip out of my fabric, because would create a 2 inch finished half rectangle. You have all sorts of options with specialty rulers that you don't with some that are out there on the market. And what I want you to do is see how versatile these rulers are that we use that are designed by our friend Kay England. They're much the same as what we carry from Creative Grid or Easy Ruler, but I like the way they're engineered better because they have a lot more variety to them. So I'm going to take out that half rectangle, and I'm going to be using the half rectangle, and just like we had in lesson 2, we have a left and a right and they're directional. Now if you notice, I'm showing you how it pairs up with the bias triangle. However, we're not using the bias triangle for this. So I've got a 2.5 inch strip here, and I'm first going to cut off the one side of this so I have a 90-degree angle on that side. I love this little 4 inch by 14 inch ruler. It's one of the sets that's the basic rulers. And so I'm pairing this up, and I'm cutting that with a 2.5 inch. Now the bottom line is cut at that 2.5 inch, and then I'm going to turn it around, and I'm going to be notching that top corner, because that little notch, remember, is one that it's going to help us to match it up. So there I've got one half rectangle, and if you notice on this fabric when I'm cutting it all the right side up. Remember how this creates a directional challenge? Watch what happens. I now have 2 half rectangles that face the same direction because I cut them both right side up. So let's look at the background, because on this one, this is cut at the 2.5 inches. Now here, I want you to notice you can use the back side of that half rectangle and cut it into a 90-degree. And then I'm going to go up here, and I'm going to cut this at my 2.5. And again, I've got my fabric facing up at me, which again, I'm going to cut 2 of them, and I'm getting directional rectangles. You really have to pay attention to this before you cut a whole bunch, because you do need them in the patterns that I'm showing you. You need a left and a right. So if you notice, all these are facing the same direction. Now it's not a big deal if I have batiks, because usually I can flip them over, but I don't. These are prints. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn that fabric over so I get the directional. Now I could explain to you why it is, but honestly, you'll do better off to cut a few, make a mistake on a few, not 700 of them, a few. And there we go. We're going to turn that one over, and we're going to cut our next side to it. What I love about these half rectangles is they don't require a long length of fabric. They're very good at chewing up scraps. Half rectangles also make an amazing border. So watch what's happening now when I've got them together. Now, when I go to put them together, I've got my left and my right. Now in this unit, we're going to be putting our half rectangles together, and we're going to be pairing them up. And if you notice, I don't have the right direction again. So now I have to go and cut another one. I'm flipping the fabric over. To do this correctly, to make sure you get both left and right out of this unit, you would put them right sides together or wrong sides together to cut them. Or you're going to do just as I'm showing you here. And so these are going to be 2 inch finish. Means that whole unit, the height of what you're looking at, would be 4 inch finished. And look at this, I can get that out of that skinny little piece. This is a terrific shape to use as a border or as stars. What you're basically doing with that half rectangle sometimes is you look at pairing it up so that you can use it much like you use half square triangles. However, they're going to be tall and skinny, which is going to make it really fascinating. And look at this, I got all my pieces. If I was making this coordinated by cutting 2 of them up, facing up, and 2 of them facing down. Let's go look at a different size. Now we're going to go with the size that we have for this pattern. And then this one, I wrote it for you such that these are going to be cut out of 3.5-inch strips. And so we're going to be cutting those half rectangles out of 3.5-inch strips. And so that width of that center piece that you're looking at, that's 6 inches finished. And then I have 3-inch squares on the outside edge. This block is going to finish at 9 inches, which means it's going to finish off raw edge to raw edge, 9.5 by 9.5. So I'm taking a yellow fabric that I have, a bigger piece, and I'm putting it right sides together. And this time I'm going to cut it at 3.5 inches. Well, let me see if I can get more out of them that way. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'm just finger pressing that down so that it's together. And voila, it's not big enough. It's only 3 inches, rats. So I'm going to take it and flip it the other way. These are scraps, and that's what I'm working out of this piece. And so I can always go into my next steps and cut other fabrics. Now I'm going to cut the one side of it so I have a straight line. And then I flip it over, and now it's wrong sides together, and it's 3.5 inches. Notice how I keep 4 fingers on my ruler, 1 pinky off, and so that way my ruler doesn't slip on me. I love working with this smaller 4x14. It's one of my favorite little rulers, and for a basic straight line ruler. Now I'm going to go in here with my half rectangle, and I'm lining that baseline up at 3.5 inches because this is now the size that I'm going to be cutting the ones for the pattern. And let me get in there a little bit so you can see there's 3.5 inches on the bottom, and I keep more fingers on the ruler and a few off, and then I go back and I cut that notch out. It's going to make it so much easier for me to be able to put these together. And so if you notice, what I'm doing is I'm lining this up with the 2 tops so that I can be doing that surround around the puss in the corner block that's in the middle of this lesson number 3 block. So I'm going to carefully notch that off. All I really do is push my blade down a tiny bit there. And so I'm spreading these out. Now this, I wouldn't cut a lot of them out of the same fabric over and again because you really are only going to need 8 for each block. And so you kind of want, if you want it scrappy, that's what it's going to look like. And I'm going to show you what happened if you don't do it scrappy. So we'll be looking at a layout. And so I'm going to come up here on my black fabric. Now, my Kona solid is not directional because it's the same color on both sides because it's a solid. And what's great about this, when I do units like this, I don't have to fuss with right sides together or wrong sides together. However, I did put the wrong sides together on this right off of the piece that I cut off of a strip. Now it's 3.5 inches. I'm going to cut that back line at a 90-degree angle. Now I'm going to slip that around. I'm going to put my half rectangle ruler on there. Baseline on the bottom is cut at 3.5 inches. I'm going to notch that corner off. It's just a tiny bit, but it sure helps with matching. And then I'm going to turn the ruler over, and I'm going to cut another one. I love also knowing the specialty rulers because if I do not have a cube to match this size in AccuQuilt, I have the tools to be able to cut them. So these in AccuQuilt would be cut out of a 6-inch cube to make a 9-inch finished block. If you're new to working with us with AccuQuilt, there are a lot of things that AccuQuilt can't tell you because they don't really understand how how all of their cubes work so well. But this is a great genius. We started off with what they call a 6-inch, but the units that we cut it down into are 9 inches. Now, if you notice here, what I'm doing is I'm cutting the rectangles that are going to go around my block, and they were cut at 3.5 inches. Again, one of the reasons I love the specialty rulers is the units pair up really, really well. So for these units in this one, I'm cutting from 3.5 inches and 2 inches. So those are my 3.5 by 2 inches, and then my corners would be 2 by 2 inch squares. So let's look at this next piece. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going to AccuQuilt cutting, and we're going to be cutting these out. And as I cut these out, I'm going to be writing down how many units that I'm working with. And there's a lesson in your lesson in YouTube that shows how I count this. So what I did was I counted how many of those half rectangles I need out of background, how many of them I need out of my standard fabric. And then I wrote on them how many pieces that I'm going to need for each one. And I stacked it up because every time I layer stack of fabric on there, I'm going to get 2 half rectangles. And then, so for each side, I'm going to need to send through 4 fabrics for each side on each block. Well, I'm making 4 blocks. That means I need 16 layers of background, and I need 16 layers of a variety of my scraps. So I'm putting that up there so that I can count this out. Now, this center unit, I'm only making 4 blocks, so I just need 4 of my patterned prints to put on the top of it. So choose carefully because that's going to be the biggest piece. And now I'm going to look at my squares. So on top of each one, I have 4 corner squares, and that's all the squares I have in this block. So it means I need to lay 4 layers of print on top of this one. However, I'm also going to need 4 of those squares in the center piece. You heard me call it before the puss in the corner block, and that's the center of this one. So I'm technically going to need 8 in each block, and these are 2-inch squares that I'm going to be putting together. Now the last unit that I'm going to be needing from my pieces is I'm going to need the rectangle. So that's cube number 6. So it's the 6-inch cube, and I'm going to be needing die number 8. So for each one of them, I chose to do these as a fabric that was my background fabric. And so I'm going to get 2 out of each one, which means that I need 2 layers of fabric in each block. I have 4 blocks, so I'm going to need 8 layers of background on the back of this one. So that's all my rectangles. So I have a plan. Now I'm going to start working out of my fabrics. So I'm setting everything aside so that I can see where everything lays. The first thing that I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to be looking back in on how many small squares that I had cut from last time and how many of my half rectangles. So in lesson 2, I ended up overcutting a lot of these. So I do take the time and I'll go through and I will count these because I don't want to have a whole bunch of leftovers in this piece. Now you do what you want. Certainly there will be other opportunities you can use these pieces, but I like to take the time to count these out and figure out how many I have. Plus the fact, when I cut them earlier in lesson number 2, I was very careful about getting a wide variety of all of my 16 fabrics that I happen to put into mine. So I'm realizing how many I don't have to cut. Therefore, I'm going back into my die board and I'm actually crossing off what I don't need, or I've made changes to those numbers as to what I need. This is about the only time I'm going to do a bunch of math on this. This is because I don't want a bunch of leftover scraps. There we go, voila. I don't need any of them out of the prints. Handled. Don't be discouraged if you need to cut more, but this is the time to be handling this. Now I'm going to look at my other units. And the next one I'm going to look at is my half rectangles. Now, if you remember in lesson number 2, I inadvertently cut them all going the wrong direction, so I'm going to change them up. So on this one, I don't need any of those center squares because I had plenty of center squares. So those are already cut. I left them on top of my die board, so I remember where I'm at. There's more of my extra squares. I'm going to set them aside. Now I'm going to start doing the counting on my half rectangles. And remember, I'm going to need one going one direction, one going the other direction for each of the 4 sides of each block. So that means that I'm going to need 16 that are the left facing and 16 that are the right facing. And I'm confident that I don't need those points But now I've got to look at what I need out of my background fabric. There I've got my squares set aside. Now I'm going to be getting ready for my backgrounds. Now in my design that I did, I chose the rectangles to be out of the background fabric. And so what I want to do is I want to cut this unit big enough, and I'm going to be measuring it. And some people do write down the measurements of these base units onto their AccuQuilt cubes. I like to keep the math because I tend to make fewer mistakes. That's just me. I know that it's good for me to just keep measuring, and it doesn't take me that long. And it kind of gives me a chance to pause and think about what I'm actually cutting. And for me, that works. For some of you, you're great at reading those numbers. I tend to just like to keep cutting them. Now this is my charcoal colored, my Kona solid that I'm cutting, and then I'm going to cut it down into the units so that I can get enough of those rectangles. I only need 16 rectangles because I need 4 for each block. And so that means that as I look at this, I'm going to cut it so that I have a layer of 6 and then another layer of 6, and then I'm going to be trimming it down. Again, refer to your notes, and if you're not sure, cut some, recount, and see if you've got it figured out. I got an ample amount of, I think I got 5 yards of this charcoal colored fabric. I probably haven't worked with this one too much. I've worked with other Kona solids, but I was really enjoying how this one worked. Now I'm overcutting these as opposed to trimming them down really tight or fan folding, because I believe that I do a better job when I'm overcutting them to be the units that I need. They tend to lay better for me. And so what I'm doing is I'm stacking them up on top of my die board, and I've got everything cut there. So I've got my 16 layers cut. Now I need to be cutting my half rectangles. Now out of the rest of that strip that I was cutting for my rectangles for that die, I'm able to cut those as well out of the same strip. I cut it a little bit larger, so it's absolutely going to fit on there terrific. And so I go through and I cut them up in layers. You can send 6 layers through the Go Me and the Go Cutter. Sometimes I can send another layer or 2 through on my Go Big. Just be aware that if you do send it through on your electric cutter, if it doesn't like it, it's going to spit it back out at you. And remember last time we did this, you got a chance to see my cutter talk back to me. There you go. I've got everything stacked up, ready to go, and I'm going to go do my cutting. Shut my blade down and go back and cut. Now I'm going to show you about when you're using your rotary cutter. One of the tips that I like to do is that if my blade starts getting dull, which this one's getting dull, what I will do one time is I dismantle the whole blade. I flip that blade over, and I just flip it over one time. It does not give you twice the life, but it does give you a little bit longer life to it. I actually prefer, I recommend that you don't buy the Fisker blades and Fisker cutters. Though they say they're for materials, but they're for paper primarily, and they just happen to work with fabric. I prefer the Olfa cutter, and my real favorite that I've done is invest in the endurance blades. I'm finding that they're giving me more than 2 or 3 times as much cutting life to them. Plus the fact that if you are working with a sharp blade, you're less likely to injure your shoulder. You're also less likely to cut yourself. So let's get to stitching those blocks, because we've already cut them out now, and we're headed on over to do the stitching in the machine. And I love stitching these up. They were really easy. You can see that center is what is called the puss in the corner block. And then the outer section of it is kind of a frame to it. So it's a nice little frame. It pairs up with our block from block number 2. So the first thing I like to do is line up all my units nearby where I'm going to be using them. And I'm going to show you this is that as I'm stacking them up, I want to mix them up a little bit so that I don't end up having to dig through the whole stack. When I work scrappy, this is how I function. So then I'm stacking up my units by left and right for my rectangles, and so that I can go through and I will mix them up a little bit when I'm doing scrappy things. And then here's the other versions of them. More half rectangles. There's my half rectangles in my solid fabric. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn them over so that you can see how these look as they're paired up. And so what I've done is I've taken half of my backgrounds and I've turned them around so that I'm very sure that I'm putting these together in 1-2s. So when I set them in front of me underneath my table, I actually have them sitting that way, or set them to your left or your right, however you do it. And here's my 3 centers. I'm quite satisfied with those. And if you notice, I'm starting to lay out what's called the puss in the corner block, and that's that block in the middle. And so I've got a real good orientation. Now, if you notice, this is a 9-patch block, friends. And so let me show you how that works. So it's not a 9-patch, a standard weight 9-patch. I'm just going to put everything, all my little squares together, because they are well mixed up now. And I'm going to set everything to the side so it's out of my way so I can get going on working on these blocks a unit at a time. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take that little square and I'm going to line it up with a rectangle and I'm going to send it through my machine. And then I'm going to take my large square and I'm going to lay it atop another rectangle, and this is the bottom. And so I'm going to take the square and I'm going to lay the rectangle on top of it. So I have the one wing of my 9-patch in there. And then I actually start my next 9-patch. So I'm going to go ahead and send my next 9-patch through so that I can reach around the back of the sewing machine, and I'm going to be able to pull out my first block, and it's all going to be layered together the way I want it to be. So I now have 2 of them in there. I'm bringing that fabric around to the front. I clip it with my favorite little Ginger clips. If you notice, we always put those as something that is a really good handle to have. And then what I'm doing is I'm opening that top row of my 9-patch up, and I'm laying down the square, then the rectangle, then the corner square. So all of these are together. I reach around the back and I pick up block number 2, and then I bring block number 2 in, and then I'm going to set in there my next square. So now, again, this is just an oversized 9-patch. And now I'm going to put a rectangle on top of that center big square, head into the sewing machine, and then I'm going to put a patterned square up against that last piece of solid fabric. I reach around the back and I pull out block number 1. I open it up and I use my point-to-point turner to press that seam. I like to press that seam towards my dark fabric. And if you notice on that top part, I'm pressing it towards the dark fabric. So when I go to lay that block together, when I put it together, those are locking together. And I actually am going to step over to the other side and get the last of that 9-patch all pressed out while I have it flat in front of me. So everything is towards my dark fabric. So now I'm going to turn that over, face down. I'm going to take my By Annie's Tailor's Awl, and that helps me to get my seams exactly where I want them to be. I reach around the back, I clip off and bring out block number 2. Press towards the dark fabric with my point-to-point turner. Do you always press towards the dark fabric? No, not always. Sometimes I will, do a little bit of pressing and I'll decide to send it another direction. But I do always press my seams one direction on quilting. It's really important to do on quilting because if you don't, the compromise that you have is that now your seam openings leave it open for batting to migrate through. It also, the strength of my seam is that once this is machine quilted or hand quilted, those seams are going to stay the direction that they are. These are not seams like in the seat of your pants. They are really kind of top stitched all over the place with machine quilting. So now I'm going back and working on my block, finishing it up. At this point, working on these 4 blocks companionably this way, I don't necessarily need my enders and leaders to stop in between. I have a pretty good understanding of where I'm going with it. Now, if you still need to send through enders and leaders, don't feel like you failed. If you want to just entirely work on one block, you are absolutely okay to do this. But I do trust that since you're only making 4 blocks and they're scrappy, you probably have a pretty good understanding of this to show you how you can use a block to be the ender and leader. And so working on, but I still am not going to work on any more than 2 at a time. So as I get this block number 1 and block number 2 done, and I start running out of what to send to the machine, I'm going to start working on the outer frame to these blocks. And notice that I'm working on the outer frame. I'm not doing the puss in the corner centers first because I want to go ahead and finish up an entire 1 block and an entire 2 block. So now I'm sending it through the machine with my bias rectangles so that they are going together in twosies. And if you notice, I made sure I had a left and a right facing one as I go together. And the reason I'm doing that is when I put these together as in pairs of 2s, I want them to be together so that I can say, I don't want that orange polka dot to have 2 of them facing together in my block. So now I've got that center puss in the corner block all pressed out, and I'm working on these half rectangles. And as I take these half rectangles and I go to press the seams, again, I'm pressing towards the dark fabric. I love the point-to-point turner. There really is nothing that I've seen that's not an iron that gets them as flat as this. Now notice when I'm going through this, when I'm going through the top of that, I have several seams that I'm going through on the top. So that tailor's awl, that Bianni's tailor's awl, helps me to keep control over that seam and boss it the direction that I want it to be. Also notice where those notches are. Those notches from our specialty rulers and from our AccuQuilt help us to match this up. Now, I sewed the 2 of them together so that those rectangles are together, and now I'm going to attach it to one side of my block. So in this one in particular, I tried pressing that center seam of those half rectangles so the seam was going one direction. This is one of those very few times that I would say I did try out also opening that seam between the 2 half rectangles, that dark charcoal colored, and that was pleasing as well. At the end of the day, as we look at putting them on the 2 sides, because we're only putting them on 2 sides right now, what you want to do is that when you put them together and then you sew them to the 2 sides, you want to make sure that that fits well. Now at this point, I'm pushing that seam away from that heavy point towards the rectangles. So now I'm going to go to the other side of that puss in the corner block, and I'm going to add together a pair of those 2 half rectangles. And on this one, I'm pressing that seam with my point-to-point turner. I'm flipping it over, and then I'm coming in there and I'm sewing in there. Now again, I'm using that point-to-point turner to help really get through the bulk of that center seam. And later on is when I started pushing that seam open in the center. Now, I've got the 2 sides that have my half rectangles on them. Now I need to do 2 sides that have the half rectangles put together, but then I have a square on the outer corners to put that together. So again, pressing that seam very carefully towards that dark rectangle, the background rectangle. And now I'm going to go ahead and keep finishing more of these together. The other reason that it's important that you work on these a few at a time is what you just saw. You might have seen that, but behind my needle right now, I put 2 of the prints together, which means I have to unsew something here in just a moment. And this is why you don't want to do all of those at a time, because if you make a mistake on one, you have a tendency to make a mistake on others. So I'm going to come back on this one. I'm going to clip out about every 5th stitch, and then I'm going to turn it over, and then I'm going to pull my other thread out of the bottom, and then I'm going to turn it around and fix it right there where I need to be. If you notice, I flipped it around so my dark is up against my dark. Again, I made a mistake on 1, not 12. Keeping on working incrementally like this. It's good to keep your mind sharp. It's also really good to help you not make such big mistakes that you are really undoing yourself trying to fix it. So now I'm going to add a corner, one of those little 2-inch squares to one side of it, and then I'm going to chain piece my next piece in to the machine, and I can control how scrappy I make this. I can say I want yellow next to blue, and it really gives me a chance to study it. If you are really fussy about where your colors land, you're going to really appreciate this step. And if you haven't worked scrappy much before, this is how it becomes much more enjoyable for you. Now I'm pressing the bulk of those seams towards the corner, and you'll see in a moment when I line that up against the Puss in the Corner block, that's how I'm making that decision. There is no hard, fast rule on which direction to press these seams. The main thing is as much as possible, whenever you can get those seams to lock, is golden. So I'm laying that down in that piece. I've sewn it into place, and now if you look at it, the seams are going correct. So what happens is when I lock them in there, I don't have a lot of bulk in those corners. So I press that towards the outside edge, and it pairs up really nicely and fits in there and makes this block so square. Please, please, please do not run to the ironing board while you're piecing the block. In fact, I don't go to the ironing board until I have it all sewn together with my other blocks. Because what you're doing is when you keep ironing in between, you are putting yourself in a compromised position in that you're stretching, especially these bias rectangles, and you do not want to overstretch this. So now that I've done one complete block, I'm comfortable going in and sewing more of the units and keeping on pressing. And I use that same system where I've got those 3 tools next to me. I've got my Ginger thread snips, which I love, my point-to-point turner, which is the best seam pressing piece, and my Bianni's Tailor's Awl to help me guide these through and keep on going through. Now you notice at this point I'm starting to open that seam in the middle between those 2 black charcoal half rectangles, and this is about the only time I do that because I have so much bulk in there. It's kind of an unusual seam to work with, so this is one of those few times that I would open it. But again, what's nice about this, that Puss in the Corner block in the middle keeps you square. You have a good idea of if your block is the right size. So in that case, I don't have a problem with that seam being opened up. So I'm going in and I'm sewing together another Puss in the Corner. This time, and I like to change it up a little bit, this time I started with the middle and I worked out. When I get that whole block done, I am using my point-to-point turner to boss all those seams the directions that I started them out. That way then when I go to my ironing board, when I go to my steam iron and I steam these together with my other blocks, I've already told all the seams the direction they're going. This is a really easy and fun block to put together, and we'll explore how this is going together. Ran out of thread there in the bobbin. That happens. Thankfully, I have a thread alarm on this machine. I love doing this where even though we've got 4 blocks and I could have chain pieced the whole thing together, I love being able to get an entire block done. Then if I go to dinner, if I go for a walk, if I get interrupted, I know right where I left off and I have no problems with it at all. Keep pressing as we go along. It's so satisfying to sew this way. I hope you can evolve to sewing this way with a lot of your pieces. Now for this one in the instructions, I'm telling you you only need 4 blocks because it's going to go together with your 5 blocks. So we're going to be making a great 9 patch. I'm going to show you how to put that together, but we're also going to explore other color options because we've had some people concerned about if their 4 patches are going in the right direction. They're going the right direction for you. And the piece that we're doing today with this 9 patch and that we're putting together 5 of block 2 and 4 of block 3 gives you an opportunity to explore so many other things you can do with this. I'm also encouraging you to do this scrappy because I'm going to show you a big quilt that I made of this entirely out of K. England fabrics. That's a scrappy beauty, and it took me a long time to put together because I worked on it entirely as enders and leaders. And so then when I got it done, I had Puss in the Corner blocks, I had half square rectangles, and half rectangles that I was working on. And it is a scrappy wonder. And it really, scrappy can be challenging for me too. It doesn't, I mean, I tend to like a little bit of really starkness, but if you notice as you're looking at other people's quilts that you're seeing and blocks that you're seeing, the people that are using darker or more pronounced backgrounds have a lot more ability to put mediums and lights in there. I even put, like up against this dark charcoal background, I went ahead and put dark charcoal in there sometimes, or a print fabric that had navy in it. I was fine. I was more easygoing about the contrast because of all of the other vibrant colors that I had in my prints that I worked with. Coming in on the home stretch. Never ever watch my video and think, gee, she sews really fast. This is sped up in some cases, it's slowed down in some cases so that I can show you what I need to show you so that you can be more confident in what you're doing. And I hope this helps you. Just don't compare yourself. Quit comparing yourself to somebody else. I actually sew incredibly slow and systematic, but since I'm not getting up and running to the ironing board all the time, and I'm not pressing all the time, and I'm sewing a block at a time, frankly, I sew faster than I did even like 5 or 10 years ago. And even though my eyes aren't as good as they were 5 or 10 years ago, my dexterity isn't the same. I am sewing faster now using these techniques. I give a lot of credit to my mentor and friend Kay England for teaching me a lot of these things. And also working alongside of you in Mystery Monday, I hear what your concerns are. We talk about which way to press the seams and how to master this. This is not designed to be mastery, that I'm going to master it forever. It's designed to help you to keep learning. Your ability to be flexible is the secret to being a more joyful person as you mature. And I think that that's a really important lesson. Patience is really, 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 really such a joyful thing for you. So let's look at this next part. We've got these 4 blocks that I put together. They were a blast to sew together. They just came out so happy and joyful. And this block is going to be a really fun one. So what we're going to do is next is we're going to set with the blocks from lesson 2. And so I'm starting off with those blocks that we're putting into the sections, and we're going to be creating this as a 9 patch. So these are block number 2 that we put in the corners, and you can start seeing how the 9 patch is coming together. Now remember, this block is 9.5 inches by 9.5 inches, so it's 9 inches finished. Now I'm going to set in the blocks that we just made in lesson 3, and I'm going to pair them up with the ones from number 1. And you're going to start seeing some fascinating things as we explore how this maps out. Now, depending on what you do with your colors, you're going to see a secondary pattern come out of this, and it's going to start looking like circles. And depending on how you play with this, you have a lot of options. Now, this is just one of the units, and I wanted you to do this. We're going to be using just one of these for our finished quilt. And then I'm going to show you some playing with fabric. So this is what it looks like. I reduced the colors down to show you what happens if you start changing up just a few of those little elements in these pieces. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at this journey, and we're going to be bringing the blocks in the way that we did. So I reduced it down very minimally to just a background and 2 other colors. Here's the steps of putting it together as a 9 patch. And you can see a little bit of a secondary pattern in there that's going on. And you can see how it's starting. If you squint your eyes at it, you're going to see the curves even better. So what I did now was, we had somebody said the corners in mine were different than they were in the pattern. And so what I'm doing at this point is I'm turning the corners in block number 2 so that those corners are a little bit different. And if you notice, it almost gives a different taste and flavor to the whole quilt just by turning those around. So it's not right or wrong, it's just different. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to paint in those half rectangles around the block that we are doing in lesson 3. And what you're going to see is it, and again, this is not scrappy, but you could do this. And what it does is it creates almost like an X and O pattern in your block. And so instead of putting a background in there, I chose to put a print, another color in there. One of the great things about working with AccuQuilt that I've found that I really like is that it gives me the chance to, if I like a design, usually I just would do something like this, one quilt, and I wouldn't want to do it ever again because it was so laborious to cut and sew. However, when I'm using AccuQuilt, all of these units, I could have cut this out as a bigger block, but I also have more options to play with the colors. If I say, I wonder what would happen if I did this. I wonder what would happen if I turn these blocks around. There is not a right or wrong, and I would say 75% of the quilts that you see out there probably came out of some happy mistake somewhere along the way. And even things like this is that not all earlier quilts were the same design. A lot of times they were changed up because somebody ran out of fabric. So maybe they had to make a different block. Keeping in mind that the earlier quilts a lot of times were made out of garment fabric. Now what I'm doing is in the Puss in the Corner block, I'm changing that rectangle to one color. And it totally makes it look different. Now it might be eyeballing at you because that yellow is really, really stark. But maybe you could consider in those sections, you could make that fabric scrappy. Whatever you do, commit to it, finish this, and then come back. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and explore. You're going to start seeing another secondary pattern. You're going to see a chain coming out of these if I would have put that in all of those corners. And so you'll start seeing a secondary chain. This is where you see people using other block patterns that they can put this together. It really is a good time to experiment with some of those wild fabrics. There's a quilt that I'll be showing you I'm going to be putting it in our Zoom class, and I'm going to show you where I took a fabric that was incredibly ugly, and I'd used it for backings on a number of quilts, and I had all these silly strips left over, and I cut it up so small, and I put it into a chain in a Storm at Sea block, and it turned out so profound and so distinct and really perfect for that. So, one man's floor is another man's ceiling. Now, this is the Family Circle Scrappy Quilt that was the one that I had done. And you're going to see this as we journey around. This was all of K England fabrics. And I just cut these up in little pieces and then just went ahead and kept putting it together. It right now is a double-sized quilt. I'm going to be putting a border on it. I love studying this one. And this is one of my favorite ones to have done. And this is one of the patterns that we just explored in doing lesson number 2 and lesson number 3. On this one, these are done out of a 6-inch cube. So these are small. Now you could make it bigger. You could use an 8-inch cube. You could use a 9-inch cube. But you could also make it smaller. You could make a 4-inch cube. I hope you've enjoyed this Mystery Monday, this chance to explore using the half rectangle and the bias triangle. I hope we've made you a little bit less afraid of it. We will be coming back to look at this in other Mystery Mondays. So keep posting your pictures out on Friends of Inspired to Sew. Thank you for not sharing the patterns with people out there. This is our way of supporting your ability to do more with your scraps, with your fabrics, and to learn more about specialty rulers and AccuQuilt and to work out of your stash. Happy stitching. I look forward to seeing you next week in Mystery Monday when we explore our next set of steps. So we just have 2 more lessons, and then we're going to be talking about where we're going to go with this.